Hello, this is the Big Data and Society bookcast, where we interview authors about important new works on big data and its implications for society. My name is Kate Metcalf, and I'm an assistant editor at the journal. I'm here today with Professor Nick Seaver, who is an assistant professor of anthropology and director of the Science, Technology, and Society program at Tufts. We're here to talk about his new book, Computing Taste: Algorithms and the Makers of Music Recommendation, published by the University of Chicago Press. It's a fantastic project, and I think it helps make sense of the sorts of tensions that are produced when cultural products and the social formations that go around them are contorted into the bedrock of algorithmic systems. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Seaver.
Thank you for having me.
So, I wanted to start off by asking where the idea for the book came from. What is it about music recommendation systems that struck you as an exemplary problem for the anthropology of data?
That's a great question. And I came to it kind of the other way around from that, which is that I started this PhD project. So this was my dissertation research project originally, coming out of a master's degree in media studies, where I had been working on the history of the player piano, actually, so automatic pianos. And I was really interested in and have sort of always been interested in music as a location where questions about technology and culture collide, right? Because music is one of those domains that people think about as being really ineffably human, as being human expressive, art, feeling, and so on. But it's also highly technical, right? There's all sorts of machines involved in making music, instruments, microphones, speakers, concert halls, and now streaming services and recommendation. So music's a great spot for investigating some of these tensions between technology and culture. And so when I was applying to graduate school, I thought, what's something that exists that's kind of like that, but right now that I could study ethnographically? How about music recommendation? And so that was basically where it came from. And I kind of backed into what turned out to be a very quickly growing field in studies of algorithmic systems and big data. And so that's kind of how I came to it. And I like having come to it that way because I think it gave me a little bit of a different perspective on what's going on with big data or how we might think about some of these issues than I might have had otherwise if I had come sort of directly to the topic.
One of the things that I really appreciated about Computing Taste was how methodologically capacious it is. You detail the technical and intellectual histories of thinking about musical genre, and you spend a lot of time on the kind of technical challenges of sonic datafication. But the book is also ethnographically rich with descriptions of how these engineers themselves think and talk about music in ways that are sometimes disjunct from the work that they're doing. What do you think we gain from jointly studying these kinds of technical and folk vocabularies for engineering problems?
Thank you, Kate. That's very nice to say. Let's see. So the book is, broadly speaking, an ethnography, and in part that's mostly just because I'm an anthropologist by training, and therefore I'm kind of obligated to do an ethnography, but also I kind of get to call anything that I do ethnography. This is kind of a dirty secret of anthropology nowadays, which is that unlike other fields that have sort of competing methods and people will argue with you about whether something's ethnography or not, anthropologists will call all sorts of stuff ethnography. So I got to do a lot of fun things or interesting things in the process of doing this project that might have been hard to draw together under a different framework. But things like you were mentioning, doing close readings of certain kinds of metrics, of going to do participant observation inside of a company, interviewing people, reviewing documents about this work, doing a little bit of historical research about where did recommender systems come from. All of that stuff kind of got to come together for me under the label of ethnography, but you can call it whatever you want. And I think it's useful because there's a lot of different things going on in algorithmic systems. And this is something I've been arguing for as long as I've been arguing about algorithmic systems, which is that there's not only one good way to approach these questions. And in fact, probably the best thing for us to do, when I say us, I mean broadly, people who are sort of critical of algorithmic systems and may or may not actually make them ourselves. One of the best things we can do is to do a lot of different things to figure out what's going on in these systems. So I wouldn't want to say that everybody ought to do an ethnography, although I do find ethnography to be particularly capacious in terms of what kinds of things you can do. But yeah, I think it's important for us to not limit our studies of quote unquote algorithms to the things that we might hear officially in a computer science context, for instance, as being the defining qualities of algorithms.
So maybe sticking with the topic of engineers and their imaginations for a moment, One set of arguments in the book focuses on how engineers think about the goals of music recommendation systems. And you suggest that the language of captology and trapping allow us to understand how both behaviorist inclinations, but also imaginations of user desire and agency structure the design of these algorithms. I'm hoping you can talk a little more about captology and how this kind of analytic can help us break away from deterministic metaphors about the structuring capacities of technological systems.
Yeah, so captology is an interesting term. It originates in the sort of field of persuasive design by a guy named B.J. Fogg, who it was, I think, is the director of a persuasive design research group at Stanford. Captology, despite sounding like it's the study of trapping or the study of captivation, is actually the study of CAPT, which is computers as persuasive technologies. Now, this is a very funny etymology and a sort of unusual one, and everyone could be forgiven for thinking that captology obviously means the study of capturing people. But what it is the study of how to use computers to persuade people. So one of the things I argue in a chapter in the book is that we can use this kind of inadvertent crash into the study of capture to think about what's going on with these systems that are designed nowadays to kind of influence users. So there's a long and maybe too complicated arc that brings me through the anthropology of animal trapping, through the kind of discourse that people in these systems, working in these systems, have about what their goals are, right, to capture user attention and all of that, where I make a kind of case that we can think about recommender systems and music recommender systems in particular as a kind of trap, as a kind of technology that's designed to capture prey, and that has embodied in it a kind of model of how the prey behaves. This sounds a little bit grandiose and a little bit over the top to say that, oh yeah, it's just like a trap, right? It's just like a mouse trap or something. I'm actually teaching a seminar about the anthropology of trapping right now this semester. And one of the sort of key things in that field is to really broaden the sense of what we mean by trapping. So there's this whole spectrum of traps that range from, dropping a rock on your head to capturing you in a net, to capturing you in a box, to not capturing you really at all, but sort of having you exist in a landscape where your sort of terms of existence are controlled the same way that, say, a reindeer pastoralist might sort of control the landscape in which their reindeer live, but not even keep them in a pen. I should note that the you in a lot of those is a non-human animal for the most part. But as you get over to that other end of the spectrum, where we see these kinds of open-ended capture, we get to these things that the sort of more theory heads among us would think about as kind of Deleuzian control societies or Foucauldian governmentality or something like that. Basically, the idea is, there's all sorts of technologies that are designed to influence people, to capture them, to get them to stick around, to appeal to some sort of psychological model of them. And not all of those technologies are obviously bad or sort of nefarious at first glance, right? Recommender systems don't appear at first as being kind of like wicked technologies. I would say they've definitely taken on a different reputation since I started this project over 10 years ago now. But certainly the people who are building these systems think that what they're doing is good and useful. And, they might be right, I think, in certain contexts, but I'll leave it at that. There's definitely other places to go with it.
It's actually a perfect transition. So another set of arguments, another set of arguments in the book revolves around the spatiality of music data. And so space becomes the language of taste and genre as different projects attempt to map listener preferences within similarity matrices based on user behavior or somewhat more difficultly sonic properties. But space metaphors also color the way that engineers talk about their cultural roles more broadly, invoking these kinds of pastoral imaginations of care and guidance. So given that, and as you acknowledge in the book, these spatial tactics characterize a lot of other machine learning problems as well. What do you think we stand to learn from music recommendation about the promises and perils of spatialization in data-driven systems?
Oh, what a wonderful framing of that question. Yeah, so basically where the book ends up going is into this spot that's kind of so obvious for people who work in machine learning that they usually don't even think about it as being a kind of choice, which is this way of thinking about data as being intrinsically spatial, right? So a lot of machine learning techniques involve distributing data points in space and learning to draw lines or planes between them, right? Finding clusters of points in a space such that things that are similar are nearby and all of that. That's like the basic work of a lot of these systems, not just in recommender systems, but in machine learning more generally. And when it's not that. Often people try to make it into that to turn it into some kind of interpretable model for humans. The idea being that, we really understand, we being humans, understand these kind of spatial models of difference very well. The idea that, my favorite music is over here, your favorite music is over there. Music that I might like is like kind of close to me, but not super close to me. And I might experience my sort of exploration of music as a kind of spatial exploration, right? Like I might move around the music space, and that's the sort of terminology that they'll use. So I write in one of the chapters of the book about that metaphor and sort of what that work that metaphor does, the spatial metaphor, for machine learning practitioners. And I think the brief version is it gives you two things at the same time. It gives you a kind of scientific feel. It gives you a way to sort of locate everything in a coordinate system, to mathematize everything. But it also gives you this weirdly untheorized feel, this idea that, you're not doing anything weird here. You're just, everything exists in a space. Of course it does, right? Like that just makes sense. It's sort of untheorized. It just feels organic to people. So it's a way of simultaneously claiming a kind of scientific stature, a kind of like, oh, this is all numbers and, graphs, and a kind of organic, natural, pragmatic feel. So it sort of does that. And then the next chapter in the book, which is sort of the last of the big body chapters, sort of draws in more closely on these spatial metaphors to look at this weird set of metaphors, which is part of, sorry, this is going to be confusing, a part of another set of metaphors that other people have studied in big data. Okay, let's rewind for 1 second. A very common set of metaphors related to big data that people have critiqued in a lot of venues, including big data and society, is what we think of as naturalizing metaphors, right? So this idea that data is a kind of soil and machine learning is a kind of farming and so on, right? We're all pretty familiar with this family of metaphors and with the critique of these metaphors, right? The critique we usually make is that these naturalizing metaphors help people pretend that the data that they're using is not produced by human labor, that there's no people involved in it, it's just sort of there for the taking, and it sort of makes people, and that it's objective, right? There's all these assumptions that are sort of built into it, and we're very good in STS and sort of big data studies in critiquing that. So what I do instead in this chapter in the book is I look at a sort of subset of these metaphors, which are ones where people describe themselves as being caretakers, like farmers, gardeners, park rangers, all of these sort of weirdly organic, kind of outdoorsy metaphors for describing what you do when you tend to an algorithmic recommender system. These are spatial metaphors, right? It's about tending parks and gardens and farms. These are spaces. And they all have involved in them a form of care or some sort of obligation, some sense that the people who are doing them are caretakers or stewards of the thing that they're working on. And so I'm really interested in that because as an anthropologist, my primary concern is really to understand how the people that I'm studying think about the world and their role in it. And so I will say that, sometimes this sounds a little bit like I'm making an apology for these folks and what they're doing and say, oh, it's actually okay. And that's not really what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is get a better understanding of how people thinking about this stuff sort of make excuses for themselves, or how do they think about their own work? And if people want to use that to build on and make more critiques, I think it's a useful thing to have. So my argument that kind of goes against the naturalizing critique is that these folks who describe themselves, like data gardeners, what they're talking about is not really naturalizing, because parks and gardens and farms are not actually nature. Parks and gardens and farms are these interesting sites that are sort of the intersection of technology, nature, and culture. And so when people talk about themselves as being data gardeners, for instance, they're talking about their experience of working in this kind of domain where they know they have a lot of control, right? They get to decide kind of how things go, broadly speaking, in the system, but they don't determine everything. They experience this kind of bounded control, where surprises can still pop out of the system, where all sorts of things are not really up to them, despite the fact that they absolutely have a ton of say in sort of, what, to use the metaphor, what plants get planted, how things get pruned and whatever else. And so my argument there is that if we want to understand what those naturalizing metaphors are doing for the people who use them, at least in this context, we want to think about how they're using them to mark a break between this kind of computer work and maybe earlier forms of computer work like what they will describe as like conventional programming, right? So conventional programming versus machine learning, maybe these metaphors are helping people try to reckon with or mark a difference between those two kinds of programming. And again, we don't have to buy it, actually. We don't have to say, yeah, sure, there are differences. But one thing I say in the book is that I think these metaphors are partly an effort to try to make a difference, to say, this is not the same as what was coming before. And I draw on some anthropology theory to back that up, which we don't need to get into here. But basically, the idea is like a lot of metaphors like that are used for making differences rather than similarities, right? The point really isn't to say machine learning is like farming, but rather because machine learning is like farming, it's not like this other thing. It's not like an earlier generation of programming, which was like factory manufacture. So if you draw out the square in your mind, you can see, okay, over here, there's farming, and there's factories. We know farming and factories are different from each other. Over here, we've got conventional programming and machine learning. Those don't look that different from each other. So what are we going to do? We're going to make parallels to some other domain where there's a clearer difference, farming and factory manufacture, to try to borrow that difference and kind of emphasize a change. So I think that's often what's happening. It's not often the objectivity thing, although in some domains it absolutely is, but is rather this other thing. So that was a long-winded way of tying things together across the book, but I appreciate that you managed to find this connection across chapters that are sort of dispersed in the text.
So I know, looking forward from computing taste, I know your new work is turning toward the problem of attention. And that's certainly a subtext of the book as well. How can recommendation algorithms present us with the music that we want to give our attention to or not give our attention to in the case of something like a flow state playlist? Can you talk a little bit about how we conceptualize attention as a dynamic property in relation to a consumer algorithm like a music recommendation system?
Yeah, so I've turned my attention towards attention as a kind of cultural concept. And I can tell you that I had this very funny experience recently of going back to visit my dissertation to try to pull some things out. And I had thought that I had come up with this attention project after I started being a professor, and I needed to teach a new class. And I've been teaching this seminar called How to Pay Attention, which is a sort of anthropology of attention course for a few years now. And I was very surprised to find that I had titled the conclusion of my dissertation Toward an Anthropology of Attention, which I had forgotten. And turns out that was where I was going. I knew that at some point and forgot it. It's possible it's because I had a child in between. I won't blame my son for that. But the point about attention that's really salient in the recommender context is that obviously recommenders have as their goal a kind of attraction of attention. That's part of what I'm doing when I talk about them as captivating technologies. That's kind of how they've come to be defined. They don't have to be defined that way, but they've come to be defined largely their success in terms of how good they are at attracting attention. And so that raises all sorts of questions, like how do you measure attention? What counts as attention in a system? And so I talk a little bit in the book about various measures for this. They vary across domains, across companies, and even within a company, there's lots of measures for it. But the common one in a lot of streaming services is something called dwell time. So that's how long you spend listening to something, or if you're on a website, how long you're on the website. And it's used as a rough proxy for satisfaction. And I don't think that's an unreasonable proxy, right? If you're not satisfied with Spotify, it seems unlikely that you'll listen to Spotify that much. But of course, you might listen to Spotify a lot and still be dissatisfied with it and wish that it were better or something like that. But in any case, that kind of got me into this broader interest, which is what I'm working on now, in the variety of ways that attention is mobilized by various groups of people and in various settings as something really important. I think that one thing you see in so many domains nowadays, and I'm sort of connected to machine learning, but I think it's beyond that, is this idea that attention is like the most important thing. And it's a really interesting moment to be in. So just to give an example, we're seeing now with the emergence of systems like ChatGPT and DALL-E 2 and all of these generative AI systems, this real anxiety about the bulk of materials that are generated by computers, right? So there was just a story about a sci-fi publisher that shut down submissions because they were getting overwhelmed by submissions that were clearly computer generated. So there's this worry that machine learning systems, these generative ones, can produce what the sociologist Zeynep Tufekci calls denial of attention attacks. So kind of like overwhelming. It's an interesting metaphor to use because it's a computer metaphor, obviously, that suggests that like humans are kind of like servers and we can have denial of service attacks on us, on our ability to pay attention. But denial of attention attacks, it's an interesting and provocative framing. Okay, those systems ChatGPT, for instance, the T in GPT stands for transformer, which is a kind of neural net architecture. And inside of that is a system that is called an attention mechanism. So the guts of these transformer-based systems, which is all of these big generative models these days, have in them something that is called attention. And it doesn't look like human attention. It's kind of too complicated for me to bother getting into now. It's worth just noting that it's very much like other neural net kind of terms, where it has a very loose relationship to its biological correlate. And sometimes people overstate the connection, and sometimes they understate it depending on who they're talking to. But I'm really interested in the fact that we've got, okay, this worry about human attention, which is connected to a machine that's built out of computer attention, whatever that means. And then we've got all these other things going on around attention, right? We're worried about the attention economy. We're worried about our own capacity to pay attention. People are worried about attention of, like the youth, and people talking about, attention deficit disorder and that sort of thing. If you look at critics of social media, like the Center for Humane Technology, for instance, this is an NGO that does a lot of critical work about social media and big data. They have the documentary. It's not really a documentary. It's a promotional film on Netflix that's called The Social Dilemma, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. They center attention as like the fundamental thing, the fundamental problem of they call it the digital attention crisis, and say what's going to happen is we might have the collapse of civilization itself. So we're in this moment where attention is super important for everyone, and it does not mean the same thing in all of these cases where people are using it. And so that's what my current project is about. Tentatively called Attention Fragments, and is drawing on a bunch of interviews with people like across these different domains to think about, what does attention mean if you are a psychologist, or if you are a web developer, or if you are someone who is working on like virtual reality or facial recognition, or any of these sort of loosely connected domains. That may have gotten away from your original question, but that's where I'm going with the attention stuff.
No, that's so fantastically interesting, and I can't wait to hear more about your next project.
I'll have to come back on. Thank you.
Please do. Thank you so much for joining me.